Well, in 1966, 88% of Australians claimed to be Christian. As you would expect with immigration and cultural changes, that number's dropped in the 60-odd years since. In the 2016 census, just 52%, still a majority, of the population reported to be Christian, with 30% claiming they had no religion. Greg Sheridan, foreign editor at The Australian, is the author of God is Good for You, A Defence of Christianity in Troubled Times, a book that defends Christianity in our current climate, exploring arguments for the existence of God while interviewing some of the nation's Christian politicians. For all the falling statistics, as I said before we went to the break, this book is now in its 10th print run. So maybe God isn't as unpopular as some would make him out to be. Greg Sheridan joins me now. I thought, well, it's a terrific tribute to you, Greg, that it's 10 print runs in for a book that you would have thought, I would have thought, a title like this in these times would be a hard sell. But going into Christmas, I thought it was a great time to stop and reflect on faith. That's an extraordinary achievement, mate. Well done.
Peter, you're being way too kind, but thanks very much. I think I've discovered the way to be the very best in your field. Choose a field in which there are no other participants. So, I mean, it's the only kind of secular media journalist book in defence of Christianity. And, you know, I was partly provoked with my previous book by going to all the writers' festivals, and there was not a single book about Christianity. I thought, how weird is that, you know? But
why the absence of voices out there? Because you would think, if you look at our political history, our cultural history in Australia alone, let alone the West, some of the biggest supporters of our democracy and our sense of nationhood in years past have been church leaders, but they're almost absent from many of our national debates today.
Well, Peter, in one chapter I do trace the history of Christianity, and of course it has its abuses, but everything we like about the modern world, liberty, democracy, feminism, universalism, human dignity, comes directly from Christianity. And it is so strange and destructive that the public culture has turned against Christianity. It's exacerbated by the, you know, clerical sex abuse crises, but it was a movement long before then. I think the dominant position in universities and in the media thinks that it is rejecting Christianity, even though it uses the moral categories of Christianity all the time. And I think the crisis of modernism in the West is this attempt to kill God. Mm-hmm. And I've come to the conclusion myself, this is a controversial conclusion, and the book is a gentle book, but I've come to the controversial conclusion, the West will not really survive as the West if it abandons, ultimately, belief in God.
So why are our professional Christians, if I can call them that, so reluctant to speak the book anymore? Why are they reluctant to speak up? You look at the recent election campaign here in Australia in May, even the fact that the Prime Minister went to church, he didn't doorstop out the front like, you know, a dear friend Kevin Rudd. He wasn't pushing an overtly church-based narrative in any of the policies on the table. He kept himself out of, for example, the abortion debate in New South Wales. But nonetheless, his Christianity and his evangelical Christianity became quite a feature of the campaign. Why is that?
It's a fascinating test case, that, Peter. I admire ScoMo in the way he handles his belief. He doesn't run away from it, and he doesn't try to foist it on anybody else. He's the first leader of a major Western country who's a Pentecostal Christian. Mm-hmm. Good on him. I have a chapter on the Pentecostals, and you know, I love them. They're great. And the attacks on him for this were absurd, and they rebounded on the people who made the attacks. It's as if Christianity is something which should only be conducted by consenting adults in private with no TV cameras, as though the Prime Minister should be ashamed of being a Christian. Australian secularism never thought that Christianity would be banished from the public square. It thought that we would all be civil to each other, that, you know, particular strands of Christianity wouldn't fight with each other. That was what was meant by Australian secularism. I think the commanding heights of our culture in media and academe have been kind of colonised by these postmodern neo-Marxist ideologies, at the root of which is a hatred of our own society. And because our own society was so absolutely formed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, it becomes in the end a hatred of Christianity. And normal people, even if they can't articulate it all, they're very uneasy when these attacks on religion are made.
Just on that point you made a little earlier on, of all the tenets that make Australia and indeed the West great, have a Judeo-Christian basis to it. Is the reason why we have departed, in some respects, our support for Christianity, is that we've lost the understanding that these things have a Christian root to them? Are we not teaching that anymore?
No, I think you're right, Peter. I think that is the reason we've departed from it, and we're not teaching it anymore. So like a lot of Catholics, I hadn't read much of the Old Testament before I read this book, and the atheists, the new atheists, Richard Dawkins and so on, they're constantly attacking the Old Testament. So I read some of the Old Testament seriously, and it is the most majestic literature that you could ever read. So just the book of Job, it's the most astonishing meditation on the nature of human suffering, innocent human suffering, in all of human literature. So why wouldn't you give this to kids? Not to tell them to believe it, but just as literature. The Gospel of St. John in the New Testament is the most ravishing, breathtaking book that has ever been conceived in human imagination. Why would you not give this to kids to read? 3/4 of contemporary culture you can't understand if you don't have the Christian references. You can't understand Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. You can't understand The Lord of the Rings.
I could say the same for people who lack any classical understanding of literature. Right now we still have people in Australian society, in our communities, predominantly say our grandparents' age, who still have a strong faith, and they were living in Australia at a time where faith was still very important. When they pass, we will then have a generation that comes after them where parents will raise children themselves without any much strong Christian faith, and then there won't be that steadying influence of older Australians who can remember where faith was important in Australia. What happens when we become that secular?
Well, Peter, that's a very good question, but I'm, of course, basically an Irishman, so the situation is often desperate but not altogether serious. In other words, there's a lot of positive as well. So the first half of the book is the arguments about Christianity, the case for Christianity. The second half is reports from the field, interviewing some politicians, but then there's a whole series of chapters where there are new Christian movements in Australia. A new church is being born from the ground up. There is this wonderful liberal arts college, Campion College in Sydney.
Know it well.
There's this beautiful movement of lay people called Focolare, which is Italian for fireside, which now has millions of followers around the world who just try to live as the first followers of Jesus did. The Pentecostal churches are on fire. They're doing very well. I mean, it's fabulous music. They're great users of social media. So the old church structures are struggling. They're not lifeless. I mean, I go to a Catholic parish which has 1,000 people a week, and it's full of life and charitable works and people working for the poor. But the old structures are struggling, but there is a new Christianity being born from the ground up. Now, it's not as numerous as the old Christianity. We're losing that, but we're not going to die out there. And my sort of counsel to Christians is to be of good cheer and to come out in public. You know, I had a lot of trepidation, sort of. I often used to make jokes about tribal jokes about being a Catholic, but I had a lot of trepidation coming out saying, I believe that Jesus Christ is our Saviour. I believe in the physical resurrection, that we're all going to be subject to judgment. I believe in the four last things, heaven and hell, life and death and so on. But once I did it, it was okay, because I was saying what I believe to be the truth. I think it's the most important story in the world. And even people who absolutely disagree with me, who are conscientious atheists, generally speaking, they were accepting of all this pretty well.
Politicians, though, used to be a lot more public about their faith, and Scott Morrison to one side, they've all sort of, and I suppose Tony Abbott was public about his faith, but most of them pulled back for, I think, some of the trepidation that you've just expressed. How do we maintain faith in Australia? I mean, have we had it so good? Have we had no great baptisms of fire beyond perhaps the faith that was in and around the First World War when we sent our sons abroad and we lost so many, that have tested our faith in the way that other countries, I think of Poland a good example. I think of countries behind the curtain where their faith was victimised and persecuted. I look actually at the recent election in the UK, and Corbyn and the anti-Semitism brought out a whole lot of other faiths, not just Christian faiths, to support the Jewish faith and argue how important faith should be in our communities, is the reason why we're so loath to speak up our faith, because we're not being tested.
I think that is partly it. Why have we become so secular? There are long historical answers and then there are short-term answers. You know, we were still very faithful up to the 1950s. I think the sexual revolution has a lot to do. It's very hard for people to cope with this highly sexualised environment. The internet, the overwhelming quality of digital culture. There is the case that I think that prolonged affluence lulls people into thinking that they don't need God's mercy. But in fact, every human being stands on the brink of extinction, and they are all in need of God's mercy all the time. The English example that you cite is very interesting. Jews in England were really scared of what a Corbyn government would mean. I have Jewish friends in England who were seriously considering moving overseas. And when the chief rabbi came out and said, something terrible is happening here, all the other faith leaders joined him. The Hindu, Buddhist, Christian and indeed Islamic faith leaders all said, we are in solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters. Now, Jews are only, whatever it is, 260, 290,000 Brits. They're not electorally significant. But this was a moment when the culture said, something terrible is happening here. Now, one election result doesn't solve the problem, and I don't want to politicise religion. You know, you can be a perfectly faithful Christian and vote for centre-left parties. You know, God doesn't vote Labor or Liberal, as John Howard says. He's only confident he doesn't vote Green. But still, that was a very telling moment, I thought, in that election. Very
telling moment. Well, I think this time of year, it's good to talk books, because if people want to buy the book, they can get to a bookshop, Amazon and all the other places. As I said, the 10th print run is no mean feat. In extraordinary times, I think it's terrific that the book's doing so well. But obviously, too, we have this whole debate about Christ in Christmas. I think it's timely for a lot of reasons. Greg Sheridan, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Peter. Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas.